Jean's words hit me like a freight train. My stomach twisted and my chest burned as I sat in my Maryland kitchen. The same one where I'd raised my son Randy, cooked his favorite meals, and watched him grow into a man. I just told Jean, my daughter-in-law, about my plan to visit Randy at the military base where he'd been stationed for a year far from home serving his country. I was so proud of him, missed him so much it hurt, and thought it'd be a good idea to invite Jean along to share that pride, to show her what Randy was doing. But she looked me dead in the eye and said, "I'm not going. I don't like those people showing off their weapons and violence." Her voice was cold, sharp, like she was spitting on everything Randy stood for. I froze, my hands gripping the table, trying to wrap my head around what I'd just heard. This wasn't just about a trip. It felt like she was rejecting my son, his sacrifice, his whole life. Hello, I'm Beverly, and I'm 62 years old. Before I dive into this story, please take a moment to like, subscribe, and comment with where you're watching from. Your support means everything. I tried to keep my cool, to not let her see how much her words stung. I said, "Jean, this isn't about weapons. It's about seeing Randy, supporting him. He's been gone a year." My voice was steady, but inside I was boiling. She just shrugged, her face blank, and said, "You go if you want. I'm not interested." That was it. No explanation, no softening. It just a flat-out refusal. I felt this heat rising in me, this urge to snap back, to tell her how selfish she was being, but I swallowed it. I wasn't going to stoop to her level. Instead, I nodded and said, "Okay, I'll go alone." She didn't even look up from her phone. I sat there for a moment, staring at her, this woman my son had chosen, wondering how she could be so dismissive of him. Then I got up and started planning the trip. The next few days were a blur of preparation. I packed a small bag with clothes for the weekend, made a list of things to bring: Randy, his favorite beef jerky, some new socks, a couple of books he'd mentioned wanting. But the most important thing was an album I'd been working on for months. It was filled with photos from Randy's last deployment, when he'd helped save people during a flood in a nearby town. He'd waded through chest-deep water to pull families to safety, carried kids on his shoulders, even helped rebuild homes after the waters receded. The local paper had written about it, called him a hero, and I'd clipped every article, saved every picture. I thought maybe if Jean saw that album, she'd get it. She'd see who Randy really was, not just some guy in a uniform. I spent hours arranging those photos, writing little notes next to them, pouring my heart into it. I even left the album on the kitchen table one night, hoping Jean might flip through it, but she never did. The drive to the base was long, 6 hours through Maryland's back roads and highways. I kept replaying Jean's words in my head, turning them over, trying to figure out what she meant by showing off violence. Was she just anti-military, or was it something deeper, something about Randy himself? The more I thought about it, the angrier I got. Randy wasn't some warmonger. He was a man who put others first, who risked everything to help people he didn't even know. By the time I pulled up to the base, my hands were sore from gripping the steering wheel. The guards at the gate checked my ID, waved me through, and I parked near the visitor center. Randy was waiting for me, standing tall in his uniform, his smile so big it made my heart ache. I jumped out of the car and hugged him so tight I thought I'd never let go. "Ma, you made it," he said, his voice warm and familiar. I pulled back, looked at him, and said, "Of course I did. I'd drive 1,000 miles for you." We spent the whole day together, walking around the base, eating in the mess hall, catching up on everything. He told me about his training, the guys in his unit, the long nights and early mornings. I could see how much he loved it, how it gave him purpose. I gave him the album, and his eyes lit up when he saw it. "Ma, you kept all these?" he asked, flipping through the pages, pausing at a photo of him carrying a little girl to safety during the flood. I nodded, my throat tight. "Yeah, I wanted you to have something to remind you of what you've done." He hugged me again, and for a moment everything felt right, like it was just me and my boy against the world. I didn't tell him about Jean's refusal. I didn't want to weigh him down, not when he was already carrying so much. But as we walked around the base, I kept noticing little things: the way the other soldiers respected him, the way he carried himself with quiet strength. It made Jean's words feel even uglier, like she was blind to who he really was. That night I stayed in a small motel near the base, and as I lay in bed I couldn't stop thinking about her. I kept seeing her face, that blank stare, that shrug. By the time I started the drive back to Maryland the next morning, I was different. Something had hardened in me, not just anger, but resolve. Jean's words weren't just a one-time thing. They were a sign of how she saw Randy, how she'd always see him. When I got home, I walked straight into the living room where I had a wall of family photos. There was Randy as a kid, grinning with his first bike, Randy at his high school graduation, Randy and Jean at their wedding. I stood there staring at those pictures, my eyes locked on Jean's face. She was smiling in them, but now that smile looked fake, like she was playing a part. I started taking down every photo with her in it. I didn't tear them up or throw them away. I wasn't that dramatic. I just stacked them neatly in a box and carried it to the attic. Each one felt like a weight lifting off my shoulders. This was my home, my space, and I wasn't going to let it be filled with someone who disrespected my son. When I was done, the wall looked bare, but it felt honest, like I was finally seeing things clearly. The weeks after that were quiet. Jean didn't call to ask about the trip, and I didn't reach out either. I kept busy tending my garden, volunteering at the community center, helping out at the local Veterans Hall. But Jean's words stayed with me like a splinter I couldn't dig out. I started noticing things I'd brushed off before: how she never asked about Randy's work, how she changed the subject when I mentioned his service, how she'd barely look at him when he talked about his training. It wasn't just one comment. It was a pattern, a way of being that I hadn't wanted to see. I kept asking myself why Randy stayed with her, what he saw in her, but I didn't have an answer. Then Randy called to say he was getting a short leave, just a few days to come home. I was over the moon, but my stomach dropped when he said Jean would be with him. I wanted to tell him no, to say she wasn't welcome, but I heard the excitement in his voice and I couldn't do it. Instead, I said, "I can't wait to see you," and left it at that. But the more I thought about it, the more I knew I had to draw a line. I called him back the next day and said, "Randy, you're always welcome here, but I'd rather Jean didn't come this time." There was a long pause. So long I thought the call had dropped. Then he said, "Ma, what's going on?" I took a deep breath and told him everything. Jean's refusal, her words about weapons and violence, how they made me feel. I didn't yell or cry, just laid it out like it was plain and simple. He was quiet for a moment, then said, "Okay, Ma, I'll talk to her." His voice was heavy, like he was carrying something new. A week later, Randy showed up alone. I didn't ask why, and he didn't explain. We spent those days like we used to, cooking, his favorite chili, watching old action movies, laughing about nothing. But I could see something was off, like he was wrestling with something he wouldn't say. On his last night, he sat me down at the kitchen table and said, "Ma, I talked to Jean. She didn't mean to hurt you. She's just got her own views." I looked at him, my boy, trying to hold everything together, and I said, "Randy, her views aren't the issue. It's how she dismisses you, your life, what you do. I can't have that in my house." He nodded, but his eyes were far away, like he was stuck between two worlds. I didn't push it. I just hugged him and said, "I love you no matter what." As he drove away the next morning, I stood on the porch watching his taillights fade, wondering what would happen next, knowing things were about to get harder. Jean's shadow hung over my house, like a storm cloud that wouldn't break. After Randy's visit alone, my Maryland home felt quieter but heavier, like the air was thick with everything left unsaid. I'd drawn a line by telling him Jean wasn't welcome, and now I was living with the fallout, wondering if I'd pushed too hard or not hard enough. Then my neighbor Linda called, and her words lit a fire in me all over again. She'd seen Jean at a coffee shop in town laughing with friends, saying Randy was playing soldier, and she couldn't wait for him to get over this phase. My blood boiled as Linda repeated it, her voice hesitant but firm. Jean wasn't just dismissing Randy's work, she was mocking him, tearing down the man I'd raised, the man who'd risked everything for others. I thanked Linda for telling me, and hung up pacing my kitchen, my hands clenched so tight, my nails dug into my palms. This wasn't just about the base visit anymore, it was about Jean's whole attitude, the way she belittled Randy's life. I wanted to call her right then to lay into her for talking about my son like he was some kid with a hobby, but I stopped myself. I wasn't going to give her the satisfaction of a fight. Instead, I called Randy that night and asked him straight up, "Does Jean support you being in the military?" My voice was calm, but I was shaking inside, waiting for his answer. He sighed long and heavy, then said, "Ma, she's got her opinions, but she's my wife." That was it. No defense, no explanation, just a tired dodge. I didn't push him further, but his words sat like a stone in my gut. He was protecting her, but he didn't sound convinced, and that told me more than any argument could. I decided right then to keep Jean at arm's length. If she couldn't respect Randy's choices, I wasn't going to act like everything was fine. I stopped calling her, stopped asking Randy about her, stopped pretending she was part of my family. My home was my sanctuary, and I was done letting her poison it. But it wasn't easy. Randy was my son, and Jean was his wife, which meant she was tied to him whether I liked it or not. I threw myself into my routine to keep my mind off it, tending my garden, volunteering at the Veterans Center, helping organize a bake sale for the community church. But then I started hearing whispers from friends, people who'd known Randy since he was a boy. They said Jean was telling everyone I was overreacting, that I was trying to control Randy's life by shutting her out. One friend even said Jean called me obsessed with Randy's military career. That one hurt, not because it was true, but because it was so far from it. I wasn't obsessed, I was proud, and Jean couldn't see the difference. I didn't bite back. I didn't call those friends to set the record straight or confront Jean at her job. I just kept living my life, keeping my home a place of peace. But then one afternoon I got a letter in the mail, handwritten with Jean's name on the return address. My stomach dropped when I saw it. I sat at my kitchen table staring at the envelope for a good 10 minutes, half expecting it to burn a hole through the wood. When I finally opened it, I wished I hadn't. The letter was short, but every word was sharp, like she dipped her pen in venom. She wrote, "I'm tired of your judgment, Beverly. You're making Randy choose between us. I'm not the one obsessed with war and violence. You need to let him live his own life." I read it twice, my hands steady but my heart racing. She was turning it all around, making me the villain for loving my son, for standing up for him. I folded the letter and slid it into a drawer, not crying, not yelling, just feeling this deep, bone-weary exhaustion. I didn't tell Randy about it. I didn't want to put him in the middle any more than he already was. But that letter changed something in me. I was done hoping Jean would come around. A few weeks later, Randy called to say he was getting another leave, this time for a week. My heart leapt, but then he said, "Jean's coming with me, Ma. I hope that's okay." I froze my hand tight around the phone, every word of that letter flashing through my mind. I wanted to say no, to tell him about her accusations, her mockery, but his voice was so hopeful, so desperate for things to be okay. I couldn't crush that. Instead I said, "Randy, you know how I feel, but if you want her here, I'll respect that." He thanked me, sounding relieved, and I hung up feeling like I'd betrayed myself. I spent the next few days cleaning the house top to bottom, trying to brace myself for Jean's presence. I even pulled one of the wedding photos out of the attic and put it back on the wall, thinking maybe I could start fresh, maybe I could find a way to make this work for Randy's sake. When they arrived, the tension was thick from the second they walked through the door. Randy was all smiles, hugging me tight, saying, "Ma, it's so good to be home." Jean hung back, arms crossed, barely muttering a hello. I tried to make it normal, asking about their drive, offering them iced tea and sandwiches, but Jean's responses were short, like she was doing me a favor by speaking. Randy didn't seem to notice, or maybe he was pretending not to, chatting away about the base, his new squad leader, the usual stuff. That first night we sat down for dinner and I brought out the album I'd taken to the base, the one with Randy's flood rescue photos. I thought it might break the ice, remind Jean of what Randy was about. I slid it across the table and said, "Jean, you might like these. Randy did some incredible things during that flood." She glanced at it, didn't even touch it, and pushed it back. "I've seen enough military stuff," she said, her voice flat. Randy's smile faded, but he didn't say a word. I wanted to grab that album and shove it in her face, make her look at it, but I just picked it up and said, "All right, let's eat." My voice was calm, but inside I was screaming. The rest of the week was like walking on broken glass. Jean spent most of her time on her phone, scrolling through whatever, barely talking to me or Randy. I caught her rolling her eyes when he talked about a training exercise, and once when Randy stepped out to take a call, she leaned across the table and said, "You must love all this hero worship." I stared at her stunned and said, "It's not worship, Jean. It's pride in my son." She smirked, shook her head, and went back to her phone. I felt like I was choking on my own restraint, holding back everything I wanted to say. Randy tried to keep things light, telling stories, helping me cook, but I could see the strain in his eyes, the way he watched Jean when she wasn't looking. By the third day I was counting the hours until they left. On the last night I tried one more time to bridge the gap. I made Randy's favorite dinner, meatloaf, mashed potatoes, green beans, and set the table nice, hoping we could have one decent moment. We sat down and for a while it was okay. Randy talking about a buddy's promotion, me asking questions, Jean picking at her food. Then Randy mentioned a ceremony at the base, some award he might be up for, and Jean let out this little scoff. "Another medal for what, marching in circles," she said, not even looking up. Randy went still, his fork hovering over his plate. I gripped my glass so hard I thought it'd break. "Jean, that's enough," I said, my voice low but sharp. She looked at me, eyes narrowing, and said, "What? You don't like me being honest?" Randy cut in before I could answer, saying, "Let's just eat, okay?" His voice was tight, pleading. I nodded, biting my tongue, but the rest of the meal was silent, the air heavy with everything we weren't saying. When they left the next morning, Randy hugged me and whispered, "Thanks for trying, Ma." I nodded, my throat too tight to speak. Jean didn't say goodbye, just got in the car and stared out the window. As they drove off, I stood on the porch watching until they were gone, feeling like I'd just run a marathon. I went back inside, took down that wedding photo I'd put up, and carried it back to the attic. I wasn't angry anymore. I was done. Jean had shown me exactly who she was, and I wasn't going to keep pretending she could change. I sat at the kitchen table that night staring at the empty chairs, wondering how Randy was going to navigate this, knowing I couldn't protect him from what was coming. All I could do was be there when he needed me, and I promised myself I would be no matter what. Randy's voice on the phone shook me to my core. My heart sank as I gripped the receiver in my Maryland kitchen, the same kitchen where Gene had spat those ugly words about his service. He sounded broken, not like my strong, steady son, and when he said, "Ma, I need to come home, just me," I knew something had shattered. Gene had pushed him too far, and now my boy was caught in a storm I couldn't shield him from. I felt this fire in my chest, not just anger at her, but fear for him, for what this was doing to the man I'd raised to stand tall. I told Randy, "Of course, baby, you're always welcome," and hung up, my mind racing with what he hadn't said. I spent the next 2 days cleaning the house, stocking the fridge with his favorites, chili ingredients, cold beers, the chocolate chip cookies he loved. But I couldn't shake the dread. When he showed up that Friday, he looked like a shadow of himself, eyes dark with exhaustion, shoulders slumped like he was carrying the world. I hugged him tight at the door and said, "You're home now, let's get you fed." He gave a weak smile and said, "Thanks, Ma." We sat on the porch with beers and he started talking, his voice low, unsteady. He said Gene had given him an ultimatum: quit the military or she'd leave him. She'd been pushing for months, saying his job was ruining their marriage, that she couldn't live like this with him, always gone or training. He looked at me, eyes searching, and said, "I love her, Ma, but I love what I do. I don't know how to choose." I wanted to scream at him to let her go, to tell him Gene didn't deserve him, but I saw the pain in his face and held back. Instead I said, "Randy, you've always known who you are. Don't let anyone take that from you." He nodded, but his jaw was tight, like he was wrestling something bigger than words. We spent the weekend talking not just about Gene, but about everything: his childhood, the time he built a treehouse with his buddies, his dreams of maybe teaching one day. It was like I had my boy back, but I knew he was heading into a fight I couldn't win for him. I cooked his favorite meals, we watched old westerns, and I kept things light, but every time he went quiet I could see Gene's shadow over him. When he left Sunday night, he hugged me longer than usual and said, "I'll figure it out, Ma." I knotted my throat tight and said, "You always do." As his truck pulled away, I stood on the porch watching the taillights disappear, feeling helpless. I started praying more after that, every night at my kitchen table, asking for strength for Randy, for clarity. I kept busy at the Veterans Center helping plan a fundraiser for soldiers' families, but Gene's ultimatum hung over me like a blade. I started hearing rumors from friends. Gene was telling people Randy was wasting his life in the military, that she was planning to move out of state, maybe to her sisters in Virginia. Each whisper was like a punch, but I didn't call Randy to ask. I didn't want to burden him with gossip. Then one morning a package arrived, a small padded envelope with Randy's handwriting. My stomach twisted as I opened it, finding a note and a silver necklace, the one I'd given Gene at their wedding, a heart pendant I'd saved up $300 to buy. The note was short: "Ma, I found this in Gene's things. I think you should have it." I sat at the table holding that necklace, my hands steady but my chest tight. Gene hadn't just rejected Randy's life, she discarded this symbol of family, of my love for them both. I didn't cry, didn't throw it across the room. I just set it down and called Randy. When he answered, I said, "I got the package." "You..." "Okay," he paused, then said, "Not really, Ma, but I'm getting there." I told Gene I'm not quitting. "She's moving out next week." His voice was calm but firm, like he'd made a choice and was ready to live with it. I said, "I'm here, baby, always." And he said, "I know." We talked for a while about small things. His squad's latest drill, my garden, but when I hung up, I felt a mix of relief and sorrow. Randy was choosing himself, but it was costing him. The next few weeks were a blur. I kept the necklace in a drawer with Gene's letter, not wanting to look at either but not ready to throw them out. Randy called less often, but when he did, he sounded steadier, like he was finding his footing. He told me Gene had moved to Virginia, was staying with her sister, and they were barely talking. I didn't ask for details and he didn't offer them. I focused on my life, volunteering church, keeping my home a place of peace. But then one day I was at the grocery store and ran into Gene's cousin Marla, who I'd always liked. She pulled me aside in the cereal aisle and said, "Beverly, I'm sorry about everything. Gene's been telling people you forced Randy to pick sides." I felt that old fire flare up, but I kept my voice even and said, "Marla, I didn't force anything. Gene made her choices." She nodded, looking uncomfortable, and said, "I know. I just thought you should hear it." I thanked her and walked away, my cart half full, feeling like I'd been slapped. That night I sat down and wrote Randy a letter, not to send but to get it all out. I wrote about how proud I was of him, how I hated seeing him hurt, how I'd always be his home. I didn't mention Gene didn't rehash the fight. I just needed to say it to remind myself why I'd drawn that line. I tucked the letter in my Bible and kept going, but the rumors kept coming. Friends said Jean was posting online calling Randy stubborn and me controlling. I didn't look at her posts, I didn't need to. I knew who she was now. I started avoiding places I might run into her friends, sticking to my routine, but it felt like she was still in my life, poisoning the air from miles away. A month later, Randy called to say he was coming home again just for a weekend. I was thrilled but nervous, wondering if Jean had reached out to him, if she was trying to pull him back. When he arrived, he looked better, not great, but stronger, like he'd shed some of that weight. We sat in the living room and he said, "Ma, I'm filing for divorce. Jean's not coming back and I'm done trying." I nodded, not surprised but still aching for him. I said, "You sure about this?" He looked at me, eyes clear, and said, "Yeah, I am. I can't be someone I'm not." I reached over, squeezed his hand and said, "Then you're doing the right thing." We didn't talk about Jean after that. We spent the weekend fishing at the lake, something we hadn't done in years, and he laughed more than I'd heard in months. Before he left, he pulled out a small box and handed it to me. Inside was a photo frame with a picture of us from his high school graduation, him in his cap and gown, me beaming beside him. He said, "I found this in my stuff. Thought it belongs here." I hugged him, my eyes stinging, and said, "It sure does." I put it on the wall where Jean's photos used to be, and it felt like a reclaiming, like my home was mine again. As he drove off, I stood on the porch watching, knowing he was going to be okay, but also knowing the road ahead wasn't easy. I went back inside, looked at that photo, and promised myself I'd keep being his anchor no matter what came next. Randy's promotion hit me like a burst of sunlight after a long storm. My chest swelled with pride as I stood in my Maryland kitchen clutching the phone, his voice crackling through with excitement, saying, "Ma, they're putting me in charge of a training unit." It was the first time in years I'd heard him sound so alive, so full of purpose, and it washed away the weight of Jean's shadow that had haunted us for so long. My boy was back stronger than ever, and I couldn't wait to see him shine. I hung up the phone and started planning a celebration, my mind buzzing with ideas to make it special for Randy. I called up neighbors and friends who'd known him since he was a kid, people who'd seen him grow into the man he was now. I spent the next few days cleaning the house top to bottom, stringing up lights in the backyard and buying supplies for a big barbecue. Burgers, ribs, coleslaw, the works. When Randy arrived that weekend, he walked through the door with a grin that lit up the room, his uniform crisp, his shoulders squared. I hugged him tight and said, "You've earned this, baby." He laughed and said, "Ma, it's just a job." But I could see the pride in his eyes, the way he stood a little taller. The party was perfect. Neighbors filled the backyard. Music played from a speaker, and kids ran around chasing each other with sparklers as the sun went down. Randy was the center of it all, shaking hands, telling stories about his unit, laughing in a way I hadn't heard in too long. My friend Linda pulled me aside at one point, her eyes soft, and said, "Beverly, he's doing good. You raised him right." I nodded, my throat tight, and said, "He's finding his way." For the first time in years, my home felt full, not just of people, but of joy, like we'd turned a corner. Jean was gone from our lives, by then living in Virginia with her sister, and Randy had mentioned the divorce papers were signed. He brought it up one night during his visit, sitting at the kitchen table after everyone left. His voice was steady as he said, "It's done, Ma. Jean's out of the picture." I searched his face for pain but found none, just a quiet resolve. I said, "You okay with that?" He nodded and said, "Yeah, I am. I'm free now." I reached across the table, squeezed his hand, and said, "You always were." We didn't dwell on it, just moved on to talk about his new role. But that moment felt like a door closing, a clean break from the past. The next few months were a steady rhythm of good news. Randy threw himself into his work, calling me with updates about his trainees, how he was teaching them discipline, teamwork, the things that made him proud to serve. I could hear the fire in his voice, the same fire I'd seen when he helped those families during the flood years ago. I kept busy too, volunteering more at the Veterans Center, helping families navigate deployments, sending care packages to soldiers overseas. One day I got the idea to start a scrapbook club at the center, a place where families could make albums like the one I'd given Randy, filled with photos and memories to remind soldiers of home. I poured myself into it, buying supplies with my own money, $50 for paper, $30 for stickers, $20 for glue sticks. The first meeting was small, just 3 moms and a sister, but by the 3rd week we had a dozen people, all cutting and pasting, sharing stories about their loved ones. It felt like I was giving something back, not just to Randy but to everyone like him. One afternoon while cleaning the attic, I found the box of photos I'd taken down when Jean's words first cut me. I sat on the dusty floor flipping through them, seeing Randy's wedding, his smile so wide it hurt to look at. I didn't feel angry anymore, just a quiet regret for how things had turned out. I picked one photo, the one where Randy looked happiest, and decided to put it back on the wall. I grabbed scissors, carefully cut Jean out, and framed just Randy, his joy untouched. It wasn't about erasing her, it was about keeping what mattered. I hung it next to the photo from his high school graduation, and when I stepped back, it felt right, like my home was telling the story of us again. Randy started visiting more, sometimes just for a day, sometimes for a long weekend. Each time he seemed lighter, more like the boy who'd run through my backyard chasing fireflies. One night we were grilling steaks on the porch, and he started talking about the future, maybe going back to school when his service was done, studying history or teaching. I listened, my heart full, and said, "You'd be a great teacher." He grinned and said, "Yeah, maybe I'll be like you, always telling people what to do." We laughed, and it was like the years of tension with Jean had never happened. But life wasn't all smooth. One day I got a call from a friend at church saying she'd seen Jean's name in a local paper, something about her starting a new job in Baltimore not far from us. My stomach twisted at the thought of her being close again, stirring up trouble. I didn't tell Randy right away, but when he called that week I mentioned it, keeping my voice casual. He went quiet for a second, then said, "She can do what she wants, Ma. I'm done with that." His tone was final, no trace of longing, and I let it go. Still, I kept an eye out, half expecting her to show up at my door or call Randy with some new demand. But weeks passed, and nothing happened, and I started to believe she was really gone. I kept up with the scrapbook club, and it grew bigger than I'd expected. We started getting donations. Local businesses gave us supplies, $100 here, $50 there, and one shop even sent over a box of photo frames. I invited Randy to one of the meetings when he was in town, thinking he'd like to see what we were doing. He showed up in his civilian clothes, all smiles, and sat with the families looking through their albums. One mom showed him a page about her daughter's deployment, and Randy got this look like he was seeing his own life through her eyes. He said, "This is real special. You're giving them something to hold on to." I watched him, my chest tight with pride, and knew I'd done something right. As time went on, Randy's visits became the highlight of my weeks. We'd sit on the porch talking about everything, his trainees, my garden, the news. He started bringing friends from the base, young soldiers who'd lost their own families or just needed a home-cooked meal. My house turned into a gathering place filled with laughter, card games, and stories. One night a soldier named Mike, barely 20, looked at me across the table and said, "Miss Beverly, you're like everybody's mom." I laughed and said, "Well, somebody's got to feed you all." But inside, I felt a warmth I hadn't known I was missing. One weekend, Randy showed up with a surprise, a certificate from the base recognizing his work with the training unit. He didn't make a big deal of it, just handed it to me and said, "Thought you might want this." I read it, saw words like leadership and dedication, and felt my eyes sting. I said, "Randy, this is going on the wall." He rolled his eyes but grinned and said, "Whatever you say, Ma." I framed it that night, hung it next to his graduation photo, and stood back looking at the story my wall told: Randy's strength, his heart, his growth. Jean's name came up only once more when Randy mentioned she'd tried calling him, asking to meet up. My stomach dropped, but he waved it off and said I told her no. "I'm good where I'm at." I nodded, relieved, and said, "You are." We didn't talk about her again. Randy was moving forward, dating here and there, but not rushing into anything. One night over dinner he looked at me and said, "Ma, I'm happy. Got you, got my work, got my friends. The rest'll come when it's time." I smiled, my heart full, and said, "I know it will." As I watched him drive off the next morning, I stood on the porch feeling like we'd built something new, something stronger than what we'd lost. Randy's medal landed in my hands like a lightning bolt of pride. My chest tightened with this fierce joy as I stood in my Maryland living room holding the heavy bronze star he'd earned for his work overseas. His quiet smile telling me it was no big deal, but his eyes shining with something deeper. Jean's shadow was long gone, and now my boy was standing taller than ever, a hero in ways she'd never understand, and I felt like I'd won something too, something she could never take. Randy handed me the medal during one of his weekend visits, just slipped it into my hands after dinner like it was nothing. He said, "Ma, they gave me this for some stuff I did last year. Thought you might want to see it." I looked at it, saw the words valor and service etched into the medal, and felt my throat close up. I said, "Randy, this is going on the wall right now." He laughed, shaking his head, and said, "You're too much." But I was already grabbing a frame from the closet, one I'd bought for $20 at a craft store, and by the end of the night, that medal was hanging next to his graduation photo right where it belonged. I stepped back, looked at my wall, Randy's high school grin, his wedding joy, his certificate from the training unit, and now this. And it felt like my home was shouting his story loud and proud. Life had settled into something good, something steady. Randy was back in Maryland for good, now teaching at the base, mentoring young soldiers with the same heart he'd shown during that flood years ago. He'd been overseas for a stretch, handling a crisis that earned him that medal, but he didn't talk much about it, just said it was tough but worth it. I didn't push he'd tell me when he was ready. Instead, I focused on making my home a place for him to land. My house turned into a hub for his trainees, kids barely out of high school who'd show up for barbecues or game nights, their boots clomping on my porch, their laughter filling the air. I'd cook for them chili cornbread apple pie, spending $50 on groceries to feed a dozen hungry mouths, and they'd call me Mama Bev, their voices warm with gratitude. One night, a kid named Carlos, all of 19, said, "Miss Beverly, this is better than any restaurant." I swatted his arm and said, "You're just saying that 'cause it's free." But inside I was glowing, knowing I was giving them a piece of home. Randy was in his element with those soldiers. I'd watch him at the grill flipping burgers, telling stories about his deployments, teaching them without preaching. One evening I overheard him talking to a nervous recruit about fear, saying, "It's not about not being scared. It's about doing it anyway." The kid nodded, hanging on every word, and I saw Randy's strength not just as a soldier but as a leader. I kept volunteering at the Veterans Center, running the scrapbook club, which had grown to 20 families, all making albums for their soldiers. We'd get donations now. Local stores sent over $100 in supplies, photo paper binders, even a laminator worth $200. I'd bring Randy to the meetings when he could come, and he'd sit with the families flipping through their pages, his eyes soft as he saw their love poured into every photo. One mom thanked him for inspiring her son, and he just said, "Ma'am, he's the one doing the hard work." I watched him, my heart full, knowing he was building something bigger than himself. Jean was a memory now faded like an old photograph. I hadn't heard from her in years, and Randy never brought her up. He told me once she'd tried reaching out asking to meet, but he'd shut it down saying, "I'm good where I'm at." I believed him. He was dating again, nothing serious, just casual dinners with women he met through friends or at the base. One night over coffee he said, "Ma, I'm not rushing. Got plenty of time." I nodded and said, "You do. Just pick someone who sees you." He grinned and said, "Like you do." I laughed, swatting his arm, but I meant it. Jean had never seen him. Not really. And I wasn't going to let him settle for that again. My life was full too. I kept up with the garden, planting tomatoes and peppers, spending $30 on seeds each spring. I went to church, helped with the food pantry, and wrote letters to other military moms, sharing my story, telling them about Randy's flood rescues, the album, the fights with Jean, the way we came out stronger. I'd get replies, some handwritten, some emails, thanking me for giving them hope. One mom sent me a photo of her son holding an album. I'd helped her make his smile wide as he stood in his uniform. I framed it, hung it in my hallway, and every time I passed it I felt like I was part of something bigger. One day, Randy showed up with another surprise, a letter from the base naming him Instructor of the Year. He tried to play it cool, saying, "It's just paperwork, Ma." But I saw the spark in his eyes, the same one I'd seen when he was a kid winning a spelling bee. I said, "Paperwork, my foot. This is a big deal." I framed it, hung it next to his medal, and invited his trainees over to celebrate. We had a bonfire in the backyard, roasted marshmallows, played music too loud, and I spent $40 on hot dogs and buns to keep everyone fed. One of the soldiers, a girl named Tara, raised a soda and said to Sergeant Randy, "The best teacher we got." Everyone cheered, and Randy shook his head, embarrassed but smiling. I watched him surrounded by people who respected him, and felt like we'd come full circle. But there were challenges too. One of Randy's trainees, a kid named Jake, got injured during a drill bad enough to end his career. Randy took it hard, blaming himself, even though it wasn't his fault. He came over one night looking worn and said, "Ma, I should have seen it coming." I sat him down, gave him a beer, and said, "You can't carry that. You taught him everything you could." He nodded but stayed quiet, and I knew he was wrestling with it. I started inviting Jake to the house too, making sure he knew he wasn't alone, cooking him my lasagna, spending $20 on ingredients. Randy noticed, and one day he said, "You're saving him, Ma, same as you saved me." I shrugged and said, "Just doing what needs doing." But his words stuck with me, made me realize how far we'd come. As the years passed, my house became a second home for more soldiers. I'd have 10 or 12 at a time for Sunday dinners, spending $60 on groceries to make pot roast or fried chicken. They'd bring their stories, their fears, their dreams, and I'd listen, feed them, send them home with leftovers. Randy was always there, the anchor, making sure everyone felt welcome. One night he looked at me across the table, soldiers laughing around us, and said, "Ma, this is what I always wanted. A family like this." I nodded, my eyes stinging, and said, "You built it, baby." The final piece came one evening, when Randy and I were alone eating meatloaf at the kitchen table, the same table where Jean had dismissed him years ago. He set down his fork, looked at me and said, "Ma, you were right. I had to choose myself." I reached for his hand, held it tight and said, "You always did. And look where it got you." He smiled a real smile, and we sat there, just the two of us, the past behind us, the future wide open. I looked at my wall, at the medal, the photos, the certificates, and knew this was our legacy. Randy's heart, my home, the love we'd fought for. As he left that night, I stood on the porch watching his truck fade, knowing we'd built something unbreakable, something Jean could never touch. If this story hit you, check out the next one on your screen. Click subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss what's coming. Thanks for being